Tonight, a special edition of Charlie Rose from the State Department in Washington, D.C. We bring you Conversations on Diplomacy. This series offers an opportunity to hear previous Secretaries of State and the current Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. They reflect on the challenges of the office and address the most pressing issues of U.S. foreign policy. This evening, we bring you our second installment in this series featuring Secretary Clinton and former Secretary of State James Baker. After the death of Lawrence Eagleburger last year, there are 7 living Secretaries of State. They are Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Baker, Madeleine Albright, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, and Hillary Clinton. These conversations are being recorded at the State Department. The State Department has announced a new initiative called the U.S. Diplomacy Center. It will further our understanding of the department's work and the importance of diplomacy today. Secretary Clinton has spent nearly 4 decades in public service as an attorney, the First Lady of the United States, a senator from New York, and a candidate for the 2008 Democratic presidential nomination. She was appointed by President Obama in 2008 and has announced she will retire at the end of the presidential term in 2013. Secretary Baker served under 3 U.S. presidents. He has held some of the highest offices in American government. In addition to serving as Secretary of State under President George H.W. Bush, he was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Treasury and White House Chief of Staff. Here is my conversation with Hillary Clinton and James Baker at the State Department. I want to begin with this notion. You both came to this building, to State Department, from politics. Is that a good background?
Well, I certainly think so. That may not be surprising for Jim to hear, but it might be for some. There are lots of different routes to this job, and we can look back at our predecessors, the 66 that came before me, and see such accomplished men and then finally women. But I think bringing a political experience to the job, particularly in recent times, has been very beneficial because everybody has politics. Even authoritarian regimes have their own brand of politics. And understanding what motivates people, what moves them, how to create coalitions, especially in the time that I find myself serving, has been extremely helpful.
Secretary Baker, as I said, you were Chief of Staff, you ran political campaigns, but you also served in a number of positions, including Secretary of Treasury. But you know politics. Is that beneficial?
Politics, you
Yes,
say?
Sir.
Yeah, it's very, very beneficial. I agree wholeheartedly with what the Secretary said. In fact, I entitled my memoirs about my 3.5 years as Secretary of State, I called it The Politics of Diplomacy. And in there I said my experience, both as a lawyer, yes, but then in politics, I found grounded me very well for this job, because the job of Secretary of State is quite political. It's very substantive, and I don't mean to suggest that there's a difference there, but it's international politics. It's politics, but it's international politics.
You both also, it should be said, you had a very close relationship with President Bush. You had been his campaign manager, you'd been his friend from Texas. You couldn't be closer than the two of you. Your relationship with President Obama was different. They used the term team of rivals to describe it. Talk about the notion of the relationship between the Secretary of State and the President.
Well, Jim has eloquently written about this. You have to have the President's confidence. You have to have a sense of a shared mission, an understanding of what's important to the President and the principles and values that he, or someday she, is fighting for. So it is in a different context where someone like Secretary Baker had a very long, close relationship with the first President Bush. I was a Senate colleague of President Obama's. We ran against each other. I was very surprised when he asked me to be Secretary of State. But it was interesting that the last time this happened, team of rivals, was a senator from New York by the name of Seward, who President Lincoln asked to be Secretary of State. And I've spent a lot of time reading about Secretary Seward, and you know, there was a meeting of the minds and a melding of purpose and vision that I feel very comfortable in representing this president and his foreign policy agenda.
I agree with all of that. To succeed, I think, as Secretary of State, you need a president that will support you and protect you and defend you, even when you're wrong. And I had such a president. And it's very, very important because everybody in Washington wants a little piece of the foreign policy turf. Everybody. And you need a president, when the stories come out in the Washington Post that the NSC is running foreign policy, who will pick up the phone and phone you and say, hey, Bake, I want you and Susan to come up to Camp David tonight, and we're going to spend the weekend up there. That ends all of that kind of stuff. And you need that,
yeah,
right?
That's exactly right.
And so it's very, that relationship is critical, in my view, to the success of a Secretary of State.
You know, in listening to Jim talk, I mean, the more things change, the more they remain the same. There are story themes. There is an appetite for conflict. Henry Kissinger, as he and I discussed when you interviewed us, said he couldn't get over the fact that I wasn't fighting with the National Security Advisor or the Secretary of Defense or you name it. And so you do have to not only work hard to make sure that the relationship with the president is positive and strong and perceived as such, but also to make sure that the whole team functions, because you don't want a lot of wasted time and energy. I mean, the world is moving too fast. There's so much going on. And you have to be given the level of trust and confidence that enable you to go out there and make these decisions. We were talking before we came out about, what I had to do in China a month ago with negotiating once, negotiating twice on the blind lawyer dissident. And you have to have people back in Washington who, when the inevitable second guessing and all the rest of it goes on, can say, look, we're going to see this through and it's going to be okay. We're just going to make sure that we're on the same path together. And that happens in every administration, and the quality of that relationship is determined whether you stay focused and effective or not.
And the president can stop all that sniping and second guessing, and that's, of course, what you want. I'm reminded of the fact that in the first few months of our administration, way back in 1989, we had a Chinese dissident who came to the U.S. Embassy and sought refuge and asylum, and we had to deal with a guy named Fang Lejeur. Yeah. And it was almost the same kind of experience that Secretary Clinton had.
And every president says, oh, I don't need this.
That's right. That's right.
And you just have to navigate through it and make it turn out okay.
That's right.
How was it that it turned out okay?
On that particular case, well, I think in the case of Chen Guangcheng, it was in part because we did the right thing. I mean, it always helps if you believe you're doing the right thing. We did the right thing by giving refuge and medical care to this man who had escaped from a brutal house arrest after an unjust imprisonment. It was something that was in accordance with our values, even though we knew that it was going to be a difficult diplomatic follow-through with the Chinese. The fact that we had this strategic and economic dialogue that had become very important to us both the United States and China, that I was on my way there for our fourth meeting, had everybody invested in trying to work through whatever the difficulties were. And I had also worked very well and on a lot of challenging issues, not all of which we agreed on, with my counterparts in the Chinese government, most particularly State Councilor Dai Bingguo. And so we were very frank. I mean, they didn't like it that this man ended up in our embassy. We stood our ground and said, look, this is who we are as Americans. We have a chance to make this better than it would be otherwise. Let's work together, which we had to do not once but twice. But at the end, I think it showed a level of confidence and even trust in the good faith of each side that enabled us to work it through.
What ought to be our policy towards China today?
I think the policy that we should be pursuing is pretty much the policy we are pursuing. I come, of course, I came over here with a Treasury hat on. I'd been Secretary of the Treasury for 4 years, interrupted by a political campaign. But one of our big gripes today with China is that they manipulate their currency, and they do. Now, should we call them a manipulator or not? Or would we be better off trying to get over that hurdle quietly through quiet diplomacy and serious diplomacy and strong diplomacy? That's my view of the way we ought to be approaching that. But with respect to China generally, Charlie, we have a big interest in having the best possible relationship we can with China, and they have a big interest in having the best possible relationship they can with us. There are many areas of common interest: trade, regional security, energy, you name it. A lot of areas where our interests converge, and we should seek to magnify those and emphasize those. But we have areas of differences too. We got Tibet, we got Taiwan, we got the currency problem, we got we got the Iranian nuclear issue. Right. So where we differ, we have to manage those differences, but continue to work with them. That's what diplomacy is all about, frankly. I mean, you have to find a way to manage the differences and magnify the common areas of agreement.
Are you hopeful that you'll be able to get them on board with respect to Iran and with respect to Syria?
Well, with respect to Iran, they are on board. You know, one of the real successes of our diplomatic strategy toward Iran, which was to be willing to engage with them, but to keep a very clear pressure track going, is that the Chinese and the Russians are part of a unified negotiating stance that we have presented to the Iranians most recently in Moscow. I think the Iranians have been surprised. They have expended a certain amount of effort to try to break apart this so-called P5+1, and they haven't been successful. The Russians and the Chinese have been absolutely clear. They don't want to see Iran with a nuclear weapon. They have to see concrete steps taken by Iran that are in line with Iran's international obligations. And we have said we'll do action for action, but we have to see some willingness on the part of the Iranians to act first. So I think it took 3+ years, because one of the efforts that we've been engaged in is to make the case that, as difficult as it is to put these sanctions on Iran, and particularly to ask countries like China to decrease their crude oil purchases from Iran, the alternatives are much worse. And we've seen China slowly but surely take actions, along with some other countries for whom it was quite difficult: Japan, South Korea, India, etc. So on Iran, they are very much with us in the international arena.
Will they support an oil embargo?
Well, absent some action by Iran between now and July 1st, the oil embargo is going into effect. And that's been very clear from the beginning, that we were on this track. I have to certify under American laws whether or not countries are reducing their purchases of crude oil from Iran, and I was able to certify that India was, Japan was, South Korea was, and we think, based on the latest data, that China is also moving in that direction. And thankfully, there's been enough supply in the market that countries have been able to change suppliers. On Syria, you know, so far they've taken Russia's lead on Syria. But we're working on that every single day as well.
Why do they do that? Why do they take Russia's lead?
Well, I think that both Russia and China have a very strong aversion to interference in internal affairs.
Sovereignty issues.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so for the Russians, I was with President Obama in Mexico 2 days ago. We had a 2-hour meeting with President Putin. they're just, they don't want anything to do with it. They find it quite threatening, and basically they reject it out of hand. So anything that smacks of interference for the Russians and for the Chinese, they presume against. There are other reasons, but that's the principal objection that they make.
Would coming to different countries and different points, but they somehow come together on these issues. Syria, and with respect to Russia and the role they are playing, and the role that the United States is playing, and the role that the region can play. What should we be doing, and what is the risk of not doing?
Well, I'll answer that in just a minute, but first let me say, if we're going to have differences with Russia, and we do have some differences with Russia, it seems to me the most important difference we might have is with respect to Iran, and we don't have that now, and that's really important. And I don't think we ought to create a problem with Russia vis-a-vis what we want to do in Iran about their nuclear ambitions as a result of something we might do in Syria. I just think the Iranian issue there is far more important, really, than how we resolve the Syrian issue. How should we resolve the Syrian issue? I think we should continue to support a political transition in the government in Syria. But I think we ought to support it diplomatically, politically, and economically in every way that we can. But we should be very leery, extremely leery about being drawn into any kind of a military confrontation or exercise.
Does that include supplying them with arms?
Well, that's a slippery slope. The fact of the matter is a lot of our allies are already supplying them with arms, okay? It's not something...
And our friends in the region.
Well, I say our allies in the region, they're doing it. And it's not something we have to do. And I look at Syria and I think, why are we not calling for something that we call, it may not be the right comparison, but in 1989, when we came into office, the wars in Central America were the holy grail of the left, political left in this country, and the holy grail of the political right in this country. We said if we can take these wars out of domestic politics, we can cure the foreign policy problem, and we did. How did we do it? We put it to both parties, Daniel Ortega, the hardline authoritarian dictator, if you will, of Nicaragua, and to Violeta Chamorro, the opposition candidate. We said, if you'll hold an election and both agree to abide by the results, that's the way we'll get out of this conundrum. That's what happened. And both of them did agree, finally, to abide by the results. Ortega lost. President Carter was very instrumental in getting him to leave office. Why don't we try something like that in Syria? I mean, and say, look, well, political transition is what we're looking for. Everybody, even the Russians, I think, would have difficulty saying, no, we're not going to go for an election, particularly if you let Bashar run. Let him run. Make sure you have a lot of observers in there. Make sure they can't fix the election. Why not try that?
Why not try that?
Well, actually, that is the path that we are trying. And I spoke with Kofi Annan again today. He is working on a political transition roadmap. We are somewhat disadvantaged by the fact that I think Assad still believes he can crush what he considers to be an illegitimate rebellion against his authority, and characterizes everyone who opposes him as a terrorist who is supported by foreign interests. He's not yet at the point where he understands his legitimacy is gone, and he is on a downward slope. The other problem we have is that the opposition has not yet congealed around a figure or even a group that can command the respect and attention internally within Syria as well as internationally. So what we're doing is, number one, putting more economic pressure, because that is important, and the sanctions and trying to cut off the Syrian regime and send a message to the Syrian business class, which so far has stuck with Assad. We're also working very hard to try to prop up and better organize the opposition. We've spent a lot of time on that. It still is a work in progress. We are also pushing hard on having Kofi Annan lay down a political transition roadmap, and then getting a group of nations that would include Russia in a working group to try to sell that to both the Assad regime and to the opposition. So, I mean, the path forward is exactly as Jim has described it, getting the people and the interests on that path has been what we've been working on now for several months.
Is there a role for Iran?
At this point, it would be very difficult for Iran to be initially involved. I mean, I'm a big believer in talking to people when you can and trying to solve problems when you can. But right now, we're focused on dealing with Iran and the nuclear portfolio. That has to be our focus. Iran's always trying to get us to talk about anything else except their nuclear program. And then we also have the added problem that Iran is not just supporting Assad. They are helping him to devise and execute the very plans that he is following to suppress, oppress the opposition.
With respect to Iran, I agree with the Secretary. This is not the place to involve them. However, I would think there might be a place for them in a group with respect to Afghanistan. They helped us when we first went in there. We talked to them. They were helpful. I've never understood myself why we're doing all the laboring, doing all the labor in Iran, treasure,
in Afghanistan.
I'm sorry, in Afghanistan. Treasure, blood, and yet every country surrounding Afghanistan has a huge interest in a stable Afghanistan. Why don't we see if we can? Everybody needs to. We're leaving now, and we've said that, and I agree with that. So why don't we say, hey, look at here, you all want a stable Afghanistan? Come on in here and help us. Everybody contribute. In that instance, I think we ought to have Iran at the table.
Yeah, and we agree with that. You know, we are part of a large group of nations, as well as a smaller segment of that. Just last week, my deputy, Bill Burns, was in Kabul. Iran was there. Other countries in the region and further afield were there. Because Jim is absolutely right. I mean, part of what the problem as we look forward in Central and South Asia is that, you know, once again, Afghanistan is so strategically located, and in the neighborhood in which it finds itself, there's a lot of interests at work that have to be in some way brought to the table in order to try to have as much stability going forward. And Iran is at the table. Now, Iran oftentimes is not a constructive player, but we're going to keep them at the table and try to do what we can on behalf of Afghanistan for them to be more positive force.
This question about Iran, my understanding of the administration's position on containment is that that dog will not hunt, right?
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
I agree with that.
Containment will not work.
I agree with that. My personal position on that is this: we ought to try every possible avenue we can to see if we can get them to correct their desire and goal of acquiring a nuclear weapon, but we cannot let them acquire that weapon. We are the only country in the world that can stop that. The Israelis, in my opinion, do not have the capability of stopping it. They can delay it. There will also be many, many side effects, all of them adverse, from an Israeli strike. But at the end of the day, if we don't get it done the way the administration's working on it now, which I totally agree with, then we ought to take them out.
Secretary Clinton.
Well, we're working hard. We're working hard.
I said at the end of the day may be next year. It will be. It will be next year.
Yeah, look,
I'm waiting.
Look, I think the president has been very, very clear on this. He has always said all options are on the table, and he means it.
But as you know, the question is not whether they will have a nuclear weapon, but whether they will have the capacity to quickly have a nuclear weapon.
Well, that is obviously the question, and that is why Jim said, you know, at the end of the day, maybe a year. I mean, these kinds of calculations are...
Maybe more than that.
Maybe more than that. They're difficult to make. That a lot of countries around the world have what's called breakout capacity.
Right.
They have stopped short of it. They have not pursued it. They have found it not to be in their interests or in the interests of regional stability.
But do you think that's what they mean and that's what they intend?
Well, that's what we're testing. That's what every meeting with them is about, to try to really probe and see what kinds of commitments we can get out of them. Now, at this point, we don't have them, so I can't speak to what they might be if they are ever to be presented. But that's why we have to, you know, take this meeting by meeting and pursue it as hard as we can.
And the problem is not so much the threat they would represent to us or to Israel or to our allies somewhere in the region. It's the proliferation problem, because it would really then be out of control. And that's the real thing you have to guard. And that's why I would say at the end of the day, you just cannot let them have the weapon. Now, is that breakout time, or is that after they make one, or after they make 3 or 4, or after you're convinced they have the delivery vehicles? That's all for the military to decide. But at some point, you have to say that's simply not going to happen.
I think I heard that loud and clear. But you also suggested that the United States should do it rather than Israel.
Absolutely, and the reason I say that is, if you look at what Martin Dempsey said not long ago, he said if Israel hits...
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said if Israel hits the Iranian nuclear facilities, we're going to lose a lot of American lives in the region. Many people in the Israeli national security establishment have come out publicly now, you know, and questioned their leadership's view that maybe Israel ought to do it. And they say, no, Israel shouldn't do it. There are a lot of unanticipated consequences that could follow from that, not least of which is strengthening the hand of the hardliners in Iran. I mean, you don't want to do that. They're having troubles now. The sanctions are not complete yet. We want to squeeze them down more, but they're having an effect. And the government's having some problems, and you don't want to lose all that.
In fact, I mean, what Jim is saying is a really important point, because we know that there's a vigorous debate going on within the leadership decision-making group in Iran. There are those who say, look, you know, these sanctions are really biting. We're not making the kind of economic progress we should be making. We don't give up that much by saying we're not going to do a nuclear weapon and having a verifiable regime to demonstrate that. And then, frankly, there are those who are saying the best thing that could happen to us is be attacked by somebody. You know, just bring it on, because that would unify us. It would legitimize the regime. You know, you feel sometimes when you hear analysts and knowledgeable people talking about Iran that they fear so much about the survival of the regime because, you know, deep down it's not a legitimate regime. It doesn't represent the will of the people. It's kind of morphed into a kind of a military theocracy. And therefore, an argument is made constantly on the hard line side of the Iranian government that, you know, we're not going to give anything up, and in fact we're going to provoke an attack, because then we will be in power for as long as anyone can imagine.
And Charlie, let me just explain why I said I don't think the Israelis can do it, but we can. The reason I say that is the Israeli government came to the prior administration, the Bush 43 administration, and then they asked for overflight rights, they asked for bunker busting bombs, they asked for in-flight refueling capabilities, And the administration said, no, that's not in the national interest of the United States today for you to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. My understanding is that they made the same request of this administration. I don't know the answer to that for sure, Secretary Wood, but whether they did or not, that's the reason I say if anybody's going to do it, we ought to do it because we have the capability of doing it.
And hopefully we won't get to that. Okay. I mean, that would be I think
because you believe there will be a change of behavior or a change of regime.
No, I'm not going to talk about a change of regime. I see no evidence of that. I think the Iranian people deserve better, but you know that's for them to try to determine.
But there is this question too about Iran. I want to move to some other issues. Looking back at the time of the protest over the election, do you wish you'd done more? Do you wish you'd been more public, more supportive?
Well, look, at the time, there was a very strong, consistent message coming from within Iran that anything we said would undermine the legitimacy of their opposition. Now,
so this is from the opposition?
This is from the opposition coming out to us. And, you know, one can argue, were they right, were they not right? But at the time, it seemed like they had some momentum. They did not want to look like they were acting on behalf of the United States or anybody else. This was indigenous to Iran and to Iranians' discontents. And that made a lot of sense at the time, because the last thing anybody wanted was to give the regime the excuse that they didn't have to respond to the legitimate concerns arising out of that election. And what we did do, which I think was very value added, was to work overtime to keep lines of communication open. You know, we found out that you know, social media tools, one in particular was going to shut down for a long scheduled rebooting of some sort, and we intervened and said no, because the opposition uses you to communicate, to say where they're going to have demonstrations, to warn people. So we were deeply involved in a lot of public messaging that we thought did not cross the line that the opposition didn't want us to cross. That was our assessment.
Let me move to Egypt. What's the risk for the United States and what's the risk for the Middle East in terms of where the army is, where the people who created the Arab Spring is, and where the Muslim Brotherhood is?
Well, I think the risks are quite large, because for some time we've been looking at Egypt as perhaps a textbook success case of
the Arab Spring.
Of the Arab Spring, yeah. Now people say, no, it's not an Arab Spring at all, it's an Arab winter because of what's happening. And there's some, in my view, potential for that to happen. It is not, as we sit here today, not an unalloyed success, because the military have come in, they've taken power back, and it looks like they're going to keep it. And then we have a question of whether the results of the election are going to be confirmed or observed. There are all these questions coming forward within the last week or 10 days. So it's a real problem, because if Egypt goes the wrong way, if we lose the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, and that's possible if the more radical elements in Egypt end up on top after all that's happening now, that would be a very destructive and destabilizing event.
Jim is right. We are concerned, and we have expressed those concerns. We think that it is imperative that the military fulfill its promise to the Egyptian people to turn power over to the legitimate winner. We don't know yet who's going to be named the winner of the election, but we think that the military has to proceed with its commitments to do so. And so the actions that they've taken in the last week are clearly troubling. And it's been a fast-moving situation because we've had Mubarak's serious illness intervene. We don't yet have vote totals coming out. We don't yet know what the military really has meant by these statements and decrees. They've said one set of things publicly, then they've been backtracking to a certain extent. But our message has been very consistent that, look, we think, number one, they have to follow through on the democratic process. And by that we mean, yes, elections that are free and fair and legitimate, whose winner gets to assume the position of authority in the country, but who recognizes that democracy is not about one election, one time, and we have very clear expectations about what we are looking to see from whoever is declared the winner, that it has to be an inclusive democratic process, the rights of all Egyptians, women and men, Muslim and Christian, everyone has to be respected. They have to have a stake in the future of the democratic experiment in Egypt. The military has to assume an appropriate role, which is not to try to interfere with, dominate, or subvert the constitutional authority. They have to get a constitution written. There's a lot of work ahead of them. We also believe it is very much in Egypt's interest, while they're facing political turmoil and economic difficulties, to honor the peace treaty with Israel. The last thing they need is to make a decision that would undermine their stability. And furthermore, we think it's important that they reassert law and order over the Sinai, which is becoming a large, lawless area, and that they take seriously the internal threats from extremists and terrorists. So they have a lot ahead of them.
Plus the dissolution of the parliament.
Yeah.
I mean, they've just come in and dissolved the elected parliament. How do you put that Humpty Dumpty
But
back
the
together?
impression, the impression is that during the time of the revolution that was taking place, that the lines between the American and the military was very good and very strong. And does that still exist?
Well, there certainly is a continuing effort to reach out, and in fact, I know that there are ongoing conversations between our military leaders and their counterparts in Egypt, but the message is the one that I just said. You know, we expect you to support the democratic transition, to recede by turning over authority, and we are watching this unfold, but with some really clear red lines about what we think should occur based on what the people of Egypt thought they were getting. You know, one of the stories that will emerge even more in the months ahead is that the people who started the revolution in Tahrir Square decided they wouldn't really get involved in politics. And I remember being there, and this kind of goes back to your very first question, going to Cairo, you know, shortly after the success of the revolution, meeting with a large group of these mostly young people. And when I said, so are you going to form a political party? Are you going to be working on behalf of political change? They said, oh no, we're revolutionaries. We don't do politics. And I sat there and I thought, that's how revolutions get totally derailed, taken over, undermined, and they now are expressing all kinds of disappointment at the choices they had and the results. But the energy that went into creating this participatory revolution, giving people a sense of being citizens in a modern Egypt, has to be rekindled, because this, as hard as this has been, this is just the beginning. They are facing so many problems that, you know, we could list for an hour that they're going to have to deal with, and they have to somehow paint a picture for the Egyptian people about what it's going to take to get the results of this hard-fought change. This is a generational project, and, you know, preparing these young Foreign Service officers for the aftermath of these revolutions, how we manage it, how we try to exercise influence as hard as it is, because we have to be so sensitive about it. You know, that's really what diplomacy is about, and we're going to be doing that for a long time.
And the late Richard Holbrooke used to make this point. He worried that the military was shaping the world, especially in Afghanistan, and to the exclusion of diplomacy. Do you have some concerns about that?
Well, I wouldn't say to the exclusion, but certainly
An imbalance, perhaps.
Well, I think that by by most definitions, the power, the presence, the resources of the military are quite disproportionate to what we can field through the State Department and USAID. But what has happened in the last decade in Iraq and in Afghanistan has been, quite important. The growing appreciation and cooperation between our military, our diplomats, and our development experts. I call it the 3 Ds of foreign policy. And both Bob Gates and Leon Panetta were real champions of this, because they recognized that if we weren't working as an American team, we were going to get out of balance. And, it's not been an easy relationship, because there are different cultures, different expectations about what we're working for, what kind of result we're seeking. But we've learned to not just coexist, but cooperate in the field, on the ground. I give out heroism awards. I've given out about 30 of them the last 3.5 years. They've gone to diplomats who've saved soldiers' lives in PRTs in Iraq, diplomats and development experts who literally have been on the front lines in Afghanistan. So we're shaping an expeditionary diplomacy for the 21st century that has to work hand in hand with the military.
Your foreign policy has got to be supported strongly by the military, but it's got to have a diplomatic component, a very important diplomatic component. I've always said that diplomacy is best practiced with a mailed fist. That's where the military comes in. You said something about the last 10 years. Well, the last 10 years we fought 2 very long and expensive wars. So it's natural, I think, that the military side of the equation would be emphasized. I happen to believe, maybe I'm wearing my Treasury hat now, I happen to believe the American people are tired of wars. I know one thing, we're broke. We can't afford them anymore. We can't afford a lot of things, and the biggest threat facing this country today is not some threat from outside. It's not Iran, it's not nuclear weapons or anything else. It's our economic.
We better get our economic house in order.
We better damn well get our economic house in order, because the strength of our nation has always depended upon our economy. You can't be strong politically, militarily, or diplomatically if you're not strong economically.
Well, amen to that,
Yeah.
Because I've had to go around the world the last 3.5 years reassuring many leaders, both in the governments and business sectors of a lot of countries, that the United States was, moving forward economically, that, we were not ceding our leadership position. We were as present and as powerful as ever, but we recognized that we had to put our economic house in order. I was in Hong Kong during the debt ceiling debate, and all of these, billionaire moguls were at this event lining up and with, real anxiety in their faces, asking me whether the United States of America was going to default on its debt. And I said, oh, no. Then, had to hope that people were listening. So, yes, I mean, if we don't get our economic house in order, and obviously there are, perhaps some differences about how to do it, but when Secretary Baker was Secretary of the Treasury, when President Bush 41 were in office, when my husband was in office, we actually compromised. I know that some believe that's a word that has been banished from the Washington vocabulary, but I'm also spending a lot of time explaining to people in new democracies that democracy is about compromise. By definition, you don't think you have all the truth all the time, and people of good faith, of different perspectives or different parties, have to come together and hammer out these compromises. And so, of course, we've got to get back into the political work of rolling our sleeves up and solving these problems.
She's singing your hymn.
I don't disagree with that at all. No, you know that. No, sirree.
Go ahead.
On the other hand, I hate to tell you this, but based on my political experience and my public service experience, it ain't going to happen until after November.
All right.
Why haven't you asked us about Pakistan?
I'm coming to Pakistan. I mean, as fast
Well, you
as
ask her that.
All right. No. All right. So, how do you assess what the state of our relationship with Pakistan before I come back to the Secretary?
I think it's terrible. And I think it's really sad because, you know, for the duration of the Cold War, they were our ally, and India was the ally of the Soviet Union, and now all of that is changed. But the relationship is very problematic in my view. It's a tough job. I'm glad I'm not sitting there trying to deal with the Pakistani relationship. And I think we need to maintain a relationship with them. A lot of people are saying cut off all their aid, fire them, and so forth. I think we need to maintain a relationship with them because they're a nuclear power, and because it's really important that we not see nuclear conflagration in the subcontinent, and we don't want to see any more proliferation than we've seen from Pakistan.
There's a lot of bad people.
But guess what? They've been a very problematic ally. They really have, and we need to.
You mean by things like ISI and their activities?
Yeah, and the proliferation that took place under Khan, and the fact that Osama was living there in Abbottabad for all that time, and don't tell me they didn't know that, and the fact that they've now thrown this doctor in jail for 33 years who helped us find him. All of these, and they want to charge us $5,000 per truck.
I'll make this easy for you. What would a President Jim Baker do?
I think I might do what I did when I was Secretary of State, and sitting in this office one floor down. The first month I was here, one of the assistant secretaries came in and said, "Mr. Secretary, you need to sign this." I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's the certification that Pakistan is not developing a nuclear weapon." I said, "Well, they are, aren't they?" And they said, "Yes." And and like the greenhorn I was, I signed it. And the next year, at the same week, same guy came in, "Mr. Secretary, you need to sign this." I said, "What is it?" "It's the certification required under the Pressler Amendment that Pakistan is not developing a nuclear weapon." I said, "Well, they are, aren't they?" He said, "Yes, they are." And I said, "Well, why do I have to sign it?" He said, "Because the White House wants it." I said, "Well, you take it over to the White House and tell them to sign it." and I didn't sign it. And guess what? We cut off our aid. Okay, now at some point we need to seriously think about doing that. We need to get their attention.
But I thought you just said you would not cut off their aid. Are you now saying
I said
that
we need to maintain a relationship with them?
Yeah.
But we need to get their attention. Okay, we shouldn't break the relationship right now and sever the relationship totally. But we need to get their attention. And I'm very sympathetic to the people on the Hill who are saying, "Wait a minute, we're broke, we're giving taxpayer money to this country, which is not treating us right."
So there.
We are living with a country that has a lot of difficult issues, both for themselves and then for us and others. But here's what I would say. First of all, I completely agree. It is not in our interests to cut off our relationship. It is in our interest to try to better direct and manage that relationship. And there are several things that we're asking the Pakistanis to do more of and better. Number one, they've got to do more about the safe havens inside their own country. I mean, everybody knows that the Taliban's momentum has been reversed. Territory has been taken back. The Afghan security forces are performing much better, but the extremists have an ace in the hole. They just cross the border, they get, direction and funding and fighters, and they go back across the border. And What we've said to the Pakistanis is, look, if there were ever an argument in the past for your policy of hedging against Afghanistan by supporting the Haqqani network or the Afghan Taliban or the LET against India, those days are over, because that's like the guy who keeps poisonous snakes in his backyard convinced they'll only attack his neighbors. That is not what is happening inside Pakistan. They are losing sovereignty. They have large areas that are ungoverned. They've had a rash of terrible attacks. More than 30,000 Pakistanis have been killed in the last decade. They talk a lot about sovereignty. Well, the first job of any sovereign nation is to protect your own people and secure your own borders. And therefore, that's what they should be doing. And by doing so, they would help themselves, first and foremost, help the Afghans, help us, and others. Secondly, they have to be willing to recognize that as we withdraw from Afghanistan, it is in their interest to have a strong, stable Afghan government that only can come from being part of the solution, being at that table, as we were discussing earlier, to try to help with Afghanistan's economic and political and security development, rather than doing everything possible to try to undermine it. So, these are big issues that they have to come to grips with, and that's not even mentioning the need to, prevent nuclear proliferation or a nuclear incident that could occur because of the problems within their own system.
For the historical record, you believe they knew that Osama bin Laden was there?
We have never been able to prove that anyone at the upper levels knew that. I said when I first went to Pakistan as secretary in 2009 that I found it impossible to believe that somebody in their government didn't know where he was. I still believe that. And that he took up residence and built this huge compound in a military garrison town. But to be fair, we have no evidence that anybody at the upper levels, and certainly if you talk about the civilian government, because the other goal that we have is to try to strengthen democracy and a civilian government inside Pakistan. And I have no reason to believe that the civilian government knew anything. So who was in what level of responsibility in the military or the ISI, whether they were active or retired, because we do know that there are links to retired members, we've never been able to close that loop.
At the very least, they ought to stop double dealing us.
Yeah, at the very least.
And you ought to threaten them with removing aid in order to use that leverage to get them to stop?
Well, I'm not sure we give them enough that's going to make them stop. But they need to know that we're upset about this. They ought to stop double dealing.
Yeah, and they should release Dr. Afridi.
Absolutely, they ought to release him.
Which is something that is so unnecessary and gratuitous on their part. This man was an international terrorist. The Pakistanis for years claimed he was their enemy as well as ours. And my argument to them is that, this man contributed to ending the Al-Qaeda leadership that was in their country, and they shouldn't treat him like a criminal.
I want to thank Secretary Baker for coming up from Texas and sharing your ideas and your opinions with us.
Thank you.
As we have done today. We hope that other secretaries will be here and to hear people at the top of American government who had important roles and to take advantage of their own experience, their history, and to funnel that through a consideration of the challenge that faces Secretary Clinton every day. So thank both of you for this time.
Thank you, Charlie.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.